Hi, thanks for using my court coach. I'm Sarah, and I'll be your instructor today as we talk about the request for hearing and application to cancel or set aside the Voluntary Declaration of Parentage or Paternity, also known as Form FL-280. As with all our court forms, you want to fill in your identifying case caption information at the top. When would you use this form? If you or the other party has signed a voluntary declaration of parentage and you would like to have that set aside, you would use this form. If, on the other hand, the court has made a judicial determination for parentage and you want to set aside the judgment establishing parentage, this is not the form you would use. You would use FL-272. That's the Notice of Motion to Cancel or Set Aside a Judgment of Parentage. So assuming that we are talking about just the form, the next question is, when does this get filed? There is a statute of limitations that applies, meaning that there is a time frame within which you have to file this. If it is regarding or pertaining to a voluntary declaration of parentage that was filed before January 1st, 2020, then this needs to be filed before the child's second birthday. If we are talking about a voluntary declaration of parentage that was filed after January 1st, 2020, then you need to file within 2 years of the effective date of the declaration. If you are claiming that the voluntary declaration of paternity is void, there is no deadline to assert that. So we will get into the difference between just filing to set aside the basis for that, as well as what would be considered a void declaration of paternity. So first thing on this form that we see is that there's a space to fill in the date, time, and department of the hearing. If you are in a county where you can call up your clerk and they will give you a date and time over the phone, then go ahead and fill that information in. Otherwise, leave this blank, and when you go file it with the court clerk will fill that in for you. Address of the court, it's either going to be the same as noted above, or if it's a different address, you can go ahead and write that in where the hearing will be taking place. Leave this part here blank, and then below that you need to identify yourself and your role to this case. So in 5A you're going to list your name, and 5B you're going to mark the box that correctly identifies what your role is to the case. In line 6, if you mark 6A, you can request genetic testing along with your request to set aside the voluntary declaration of parentage or paternity. If you are making a claim that the voluntary declaration of parentage or paternity is void, you can mark 6B. I'm now going to just go over briefly with you what would make a voluntary declaration of parentage void. If at the time of signing, a person other than the woman who gave birth to the child or a person seeking to establish parentage through a voluntary declaration of parentage is a presumed parent because they were cohabitating as spouses when the child was conceived, or the child is a product of a marriage, then that would make the voluntary declaration of parentage void. It could also be found to be void if a court has entered a judgment of parentage of the child prior to the signing of the voluntary declaration of parentage. It could be void if another person has signed a valid voluntary declaration of parentage. It could be void if the child has a parent through artificial insemination or via surrogacy other than the signatories. It could be void if the person seeking to establish parentage is a sperm or ova donor through artificial insemination. And it could be found void if the person seeking to establish parentage asserts that they are a parent through artificial insemination, but the child was not conceived through artificial insemination. So those are the different instances where a voluntary declaration of parentage could be void. Next, you want to attach a copy of your voluntary declaration of parentage to this form, and then below that list the child's name, child's date of birth, the names of the people who signed the voluntary declaration, the date it was signed if known, and the date it was filed with Department of Child Support Services if it was and if known. If there are any other cases involving this child, that can be divorce, legal separation, parentage, custody, other could possibly be restraining order or a juvenile case. Then mark the appropriate box under 8. If the local child support agency is providing services for the child, mark 8D and specify the county where that is occurring. If there has been a court order entered based on the voluntary declaration of parentage or paternity, you want to mark box 9 and list the date and case number. And then 10, if this you're going to explain your reasons for the request. Again, if this is because you're claiming that the voluntary declaration of parentage is void, mark 10B. On the other hand, if you're just asking for it to be set aside, Then you want to identify what the basis is for the set-aside request. That can be fraud if you were kept in ignorance of the true facts by another person. It can be duress if you were threatened or mentally coerced into signing the declaration. It can be material mistake of fact if you thought the facts were different than what they really are. If we are talking about a voluntary declaration that was filed before January 1st, 2020, you can also claim as a basis to set it aside your own mistake, inadvertence, surprise, or excusable neglect, or any other reason that you think that the court might consider. You can list that specifically and identify it in 10A5. In 10C, there's some space for you to explain the facts that support your request. If you need more space than this, you're welcome to attach another sheet of paper to this. And if you do that, just mark the box that says contained in the attached declaration. Finally, you want to print your name at the bottom, sign and date, and this form is now ready to file as part of your request to cancel or set aside the voluntary declaration of parentage. I hope you found this helpful. Good luck.